In Cleveland, Ohio, a strange outbreak that strikes infants. It is a mother's worst fear. Newborns pour into a pediatric intensive care unit, their lungs damaged and bleeding. Doctors search desperately for the cause as the babies begin to die. The quest to save young lives becomes a race to find a killer. Some of the names in this program have been changed. Cleveland, Ohio, November 1994. It started with a call to the paramedics. A father dialed 911 when his newborn baby was spitting up blood.
Let's try to bring this heart rate down some. Our pulse ox is starting to...
In the ambulance, the paramedics found that 3-month-old Derek Roberts' lungs were bleeding so heavily, he was having difficulty breathing. They worked hard to keep his airways clear. As they rushed to the hospital, they put him on IV fluids to combat his extensive blood loss. They did everything they could for him. But when Derek arrived at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital, he was barely alive. Dr. Dor Dearborn was the respiratory specialist called in to consult on the case. When he heard about the infant's severe condition, he feared the worst.
When a child comes in, usually to the emergency room with bleeding coming out of the nose and or mouth, coughing blood, this is a very frightening process because we know that this can be life-threatening.
The baby's lungs were still filling with blood. His father, Alvin Roberts, was devastated. He had no idea how his newborn son had become so desperately ill.
Dad? Yeah, so you were home when this happened?
Yes, I was.
Has he been sick at all?
No, sir, not at all.
So tell me what happened this morning.
When my wife was feeding him a bottle, and all of a sudden he just started coughing up blood.
Had he ever coughed blood before?
No, he has not.
This is really quite serious. Come over here and let me show you this.
Young Derek had lost a lot of blood.
This is his heart, and this is his lungs. And see
A
how
look at Derek's x-rays confirmed to Dr. Dearborn that he had a potentially deadly condition.
and see how cloudy his lungs look? That's because there's probably blood in there. And we're going to give him a blood transfusion.
The doctor ordered transfusions to keep the infant from growing any weaker. Derek was still struggling to breathe.
The infants being in such severe respiratory status cannot breathe adequately for themselves. They're in a state of what we call respiratory failure, and we have to breathe for them.
Little Derek was put on a ventilator to help him breathe and sent to the pediatric intensive care unit.
Here.
Dr. Dearborn looked to the lab results to find the source of the dangerous symptoms.
There are a number of things that can cause bleeding in the lungs, such as trauma, such as a very severe infection. One has to sort out that the bleeding is actually coming from the lungs.
Dearborn and his colleague, pediatrician Paul Smith, were mystified. Derek had no previous history of respiratory disorders like bronchitis or allergies. There was no family history of lung disease. Test results showed that the baby's lungs had been bleeding for several days, but they had no idea why.
In the process of trying to sort out what was going on with him. We put him through all the testing we could imagine that might come up with other causes for what was going on with this infant. And we found no other causes.
While Dearborn was searching for some clue to Derek's condition, another worried parent was bringing her child to the emergency room with symptoms just as dangerous. Like little Derek, young Robert was brought to the ER when his mother found he was spitting up blood.
The danger that we need to assess quickly is to how severe it is. The more severe cases, if they don't make it to our emergency room quickly, they can die.
Dearborn requested chest x-rays along with blood and urine samples. Doctors told Robert's mother his prognosis wasn't good.
I was very scared. I was praying for him. I was crying, upset, just pacing, walking back and forth, wondering what's wrong with my son. Is he gonna be okay?
The paramedics' quick work had helped stabilize the boy's heartbeat. But the bleeding in his lungs continued. Doctors administered steroids to reduce the inflammation and swelling in his lungs, and continued suctioning blood to keep his airways open. Robert was admitted to the pediatric intensive care unit and placed on a ventilator.
It was 3 to 5 days that they required the mechanical ventilation. And then once they were stabilized off of the ventilator for a day or so in the intensive care unit, they would be transferred up to the regular floor.
The infants eventually got better and were sent home. But later that month, at an outpatient clinic associated with the Children's Hospital, Dr. Dearborn learned of 3 more cases in a single day. All were infants that had been rushed to the hospital over the preceding months with similar conditions. Now improved, they were coming back for routine checkups. But no one had put the cases together. Typically, doctors at the hospital saw at most 1 case like this a year.
It was frightening because it meant that we were having a major problem of a life-threatening problem with infants. And somehow we had to start thinking about how we were going to get ahead of this.
The Cleveland Hospital treats tens of thousands of children every year. With over 100 pediatric specialists, Dr. Dearborn wondered if more doctors could be seeing the same condition without realizing the extent of the problem. He scoured hospital records until he found 2 more babies that had come in with blood in their lungs. One case confirmed his worst fears. 6 months earlier, a baby boy had been rushed to the hospital with severe pulmonary bleeding.
One of the infants was bleeding so heavily on the ventilator that he, in essence, drowned in his own blood.
Doctors were unable to find the cause of the bleeding. Dearborn had no idea what was triggering these illnesses, but he knew he had to find out quickly before more babies died.
So how long?
Dearborn requested samples from all the children with similar symptoms. In the lab, technicians analyzed the infant's lung tissue. In all 6 cases, testing indicated the infants had suffered pulmonary hemorrhaging. Something had caused blood vessels in the baby's lungs to rupture. Dearborn discussed the findings with pediatric intensive care specialist Dr. Paul Smith. Smith speculated that the babies had come in contact with airborne toxins of some kind.
In the literature, frequently there are children that are described that are exposed to pesticides, carpet cleaner, other things in the environment such as smoke, inhaled poisons.
Dearborn reviewed the infant's charts once again, looking for clues. Some common link that all the children shared.
I started to look at the addresses where these infants are coming from, translated their addresses into census tracts, and then plotted those census tracts as to where they live.
The census maps held one startling piece of evidence. All of the babies lived in the same extended area. Inner city neighborhoods within 6 miles of the hospital.
My first thought was, well, is there something in the local environment? Are we dealing with a love canal situation? Are we dealing with an environmental contamination?
Dr. Dearborn needed help. He contacted the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Environmental epidemiologist Dr. Ruth Etzel arrived in Cleveland later that day.
I'm a medical detective. CDC calls on me when there's an epidemic of a disease that they can't understand and that they'd like to try to get to the bottom of. My job is to go out and try to solve the mystery.
Etzel and a team of health officials interviewed the children's parents.
And I do believe that we can help.
They were looking for anything the families had in common. Soon, they had several clues. All of the babies lived with cigarette smokers. All were fed formula. And all lived in houses recently damaged by water. But none of these factors could explain such a severe condition.
Since we did not know what we were dealing with, other than it seemed to be in the home, we put together a very wide net. We put together anything we could think of that these infants might be exposed to in the home, from the water to how the formula was made up, to the medications that might be in the home, and things like this.
Investigators met to pore over the information, hoping to uncover some key clue that would point them to the source of the illness. But the problem continued. As they searched, more and more children were falling ill. Carol Jameson was getting ready for work one December morning when her infant son Andrew began spitting up blood. She rushed him to nearby Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital. As the ER staff hustled Andrew into the exam room, Carol frantically explained his condition. On the surface, Andrew didn't seem too ill. The ER doctor checked his airway for any obstructions. It appeared to be clear. He ordered a battery of tests, including chest x-rays, to see if the problem was in the infant's lungs, and paged Dr. Dearborn.
I'm just going to ask that you wear the apron for this. This is the shield the baby.
The doctor was very concerned that he might be facing yet another child with life-threatening bleeding in the lungs.
So you're effectively ventilating the face? Let me just take a look.
The baby was no longer spitting up blood, but that didn't necessarily mean the bleeding had stopped.
Okay, go ahead.
Doctor, here's the x-ray.
Okay, thanks. Oh boy, yeah. We've got the right upper lobe sucked in.
Andrew's x-ray showed his lungs were inflamed. He was now the 10th confirmed case of this rare and deadly disorder.
Ma'am, besides the bleeding, he's having trouble breathing.
His breathing soon became more labored.
It's going to last longer than just...
Doctors pumped oxygen into Andrew's lungs, but his condition was quickly deteriorating. Dr. Dearborn explained to the baby's mother, Carol, what they were going to do to help Andrew breathe.
We're going to have to put a breathing tube down into his trachea. We're going to do that initially here, and then we're going to move him up to the intensive care unit where we can watch him more carefully and for a longer period of time.
Little Andrew was clinging to life, but it was only the mechanical ventilator that was keeping him alive. 1 month after the outbreak began, health officials had no idea what was causing the infants in Cleveland to become so desperately ill. For now, all they could do was hope Andrew's tiny body could fight off this sudden and mysterious illness. Something terrible was causing a life-threatening illness in the children living in Cleveland. A series of healthy infants from area inner-city neighborhoods had all developed bleeding lungs. One child did not survive. 2 others were still in critical condition, and more were falling ill each day. Cleveland pediatricians joined forces with state and local health officials and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. To find out why, they launched a case control study to compare healthy infants and sick infants from the same neighborhoods. The list of possibilities was extensive, but the results were not. They needed more information. Investigators were dispatched to the homes of the babies who had suffered from the bleeding lungs. They found that the infants' neighborhoods were in an older section of Cleveland, with some houses in poor condition. Investigators checked their homes for hazardous cleaners, paints, pesticides, anything that might have triggered the illness. They used alcohol wipes to gather residue from areas where pesticides are usually applied. They focused their efforts on the babies' rooms. Because infants' lungs are still developing, they are fragile and more sensitive. Investigators thought they might be inhaling something that wouldn't normally affect adults. They used a tiny high-tech vacuum to collect dust particles that might have caused the babies to have an allergic reaction. The particles were tested for common allergens caused by pets, insects, or dust. In all, they tested the homes for over a dozen different types of chemicals and allergens. Every patient from the neighborhood who came into the hospital with respiratory problems was examined for bleeding lungs or any other similar symptoms.
We were having multiple cases like this in our inner city community. That was very frightening because we didn't know how deep the iceberg was. Were we just seeing the top of it? Were we just seeing the few cases that were severe? And were there other cases out there that were much more subtle, that if they got ill in some certain way or had some sort of other trigger that pushed them over the edge, they would suddenly bleed and die?
Dearborn hoped that the tests on the pesticide and dust samples from the homes would give them a lead. But they did not. In fact, so far the intensive investigation had turned up nothing.
When the test results came in, we saw that they were not high enough nor prevalent enough in the case homes to be a meaningful explanation.
Dr. Ruth Etzel of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had been trying to find some kind of lead. Then a clue turned up from a most unlikely source. After talking with a colleague, Etzel learned that certain animals had suffered a similar condition as the infants when ingesting a mold called Stachybotrys.
I realized that if animals bleed from the gastrointestinal tract when they eat moldy grain, why couldn't infants bleed from the lungs when they breathe into the spores of a mold called Stachybotrys?
It seemed like a long shot. Most molds are harmless microscopic organisms found almost everywhere, indoors and out. Stachybotrys is a toxic mold, often found in homes that have suffered water damage. It appears as a dark olive gray slimy mass with either a smooth or rigid surface. When investigators remembered that all the sick children had lived in homes with recent water damage, their long shot became a working hypothesis. They decided to test the children's homes for Stachybotrys spores.
We went back to the original families and asked them if we could come to their home to measure molds in the air and on the surfaces.
They did a visual inspection of the babies' rooms looking for mold. None was found. Next, they went to the basements, the most common location for mold. Any moist environment is a perfect breeding ground for mold. Many building materials provide nutrients for mold to grow, including paper products, ceiling tiles, and wood. The investigators did find several patches of a slimy green-black mold. They wondered if it could be Stachybotrys. Although they hadn't seen any mold in the babies' bedrooms, public health officials also decided to collect air samples, looking for airborne spores. They set up special pumps containing filter cassettes to trap the particles. Investigators were on a promising track, but it would take time for the labs to run the tests. Time to see if the infants had in fact encountered the Stachybotrys mold. And as the clock ticked, more sick babies were pouring in to Cleveland's hospitals. A dozen infants in Cleveland had contracted a strange illness that caused their lungs to bleed. Now, the CDC was on the case, with local, state, and federal health officials to find the cause before more babies died. They thought the outbreak might be linked to a mold called Stachybotrys. Officials had rushed samples from the infants' homes to the lab for testing. Scientists incubated the spores in a moist, humid environment, ideal growing conditions for mold. In a few days, the mold grew. Scientists examined the first samples carefully for clues.
There were several things that were remarkable about the laboratory findings. First, we found that the homes of all the babies with lung bleeding had far more varieties of mold growing than did the homes of the babies without lung bleeding.
More significantly, Stachybotrys was found in the homes of the babies with bleeding lungs. If Stachybotrys seemed like a likely suspect, one characteristic puzzled scientists. This mold is normally slimy and moist and not airborne. They wondered if the babies could have inhaled it and how. Determined to get to the root of this outbreak, investigators in Cleveland went back to the houses of the sick children, hoping to find answers. In the basements, they discovered several patches of mold that appeared to be a dried form of Stachybotrys. Investigators believed the spores were being drawn in by basement furnaces and pulled through the ductwork into every room of the house. The theory made even more sense when something startling happened. Half the infants cured at the hospital came back, bleeding again after returning home. When Alvin Roberts brought his son Derek back to the hospital, physicians discovered that Derek had a twin sister named Diana. Although the infants shared the same environment, Diana hadn't suffered from the same symptoms. But Dearborn worried that while Diana appeared healthy, her life might in fact be in danger. He asked to examine her. Using a bronchoscope, the doctor looked into the baby girl's airways. They appeared to be functioning normally. He inserted a tube to look for any signs of blood. Diana's lungs had been bleeding, probably for some time, though not as severely as her brother's.
It was fortunate that we've detected her low-grade bleeding problem so we could protect her from having more severe bleeding, where she could have been coughing blood and really having a major life-threatening situation.
If even a seemingly healthy girl could have been affected, the condition might be much more widespread than anyone had guessed. Dr. Dearborn had the coroner examine infant death certificates dating back 3 years, focusing on children whose cause of death was listed as sudden infant death syndrome. Scientists re-examined lung tissue from over 100 deceased children and found that 6 had bleeding lungs, which may have led to their deaths. All 6 came from the same neighborhoods as the more recent cases.
This meant to us that there had been cases that we had missed, as had been our fear, and that we were dealing predominantly with a geographic location.
Andrew Jameson slowly began to recover from his life-threatening illness. When his mother Carol brought him in for his checkups, Dr. Dearborn had good news and bad news. Little Andrew would eventually make a full recovery. But as a precaution, she needed to move out of their mold-infested home.
Most of the families had been through a very frightening process. They had almost lost their infant, and they weren't going to take any risks. And so they all very readily found a new home environment with relatives to start out with, and then most of them were in rental situations, and they moved to new rental homes that we inspected and made sure were clean before they moved into them.
The evidence all seemed to point toward mold as the most probable cause. Health officials launched a public information campaign about the potential dangers associated with Stachybotrys.
A rare fungus found around standing water and paper or wood was found in the homes of sick babies. If you have any standing water in your home, such as you might find under your kitchen sink around leaky drain pipes, you're advised to clean it up.
The culprit would become known as toxic mold. And the campaign would have a profound effect on the community. Especially as the cases began to spread. Letitia McCarrick was driving to the store when she realized her son Brian had a bloody nose. Then his crying turned into a choked gurgle. Frightened, Letitia knew her little boy needed immediate medical care. She pulled off to a local business for help. Nearly 2 years after the first case appeared, a whole new group of infants in Cleveland, Ohio, were about to experience sudden and dangerous bleeding, fighting for their lives. In 1996, doctors in Ohio were battling a deadly condition that had stricken more than a dozen infants. The baby's lungs were bleeding, an extremely rare disorder in young children. Investigators believed the condition was caused by a toxic mold that was growing in the patient's homes. Letitia McGuire's infant son, Brian, had begun bleeding from his nose. Now he was having difficulty breathing. The worried mother gave paramedics Brian's medical history. She had no idea what could have caused this. An ambulance rushed him to the children's hospital. Paramedics worked quickly to suction blood from his lungs, but Brian barely responded. They rushed the baby into the emergency room, where a doctor examined him. Brian's condition was so critical, he was immediately transferred to the pediatric intensive care unit. In the middle of her panic, Letitia suddenly remembered a news story about Stachybotrys. She told the ER doctor she feared the mold might be the cause.
When I arrived at Rainbow, I was still persistent on explaining that I had seen something about this on television and that there had to be somebody at this hospital that knew what I was talking about. And they explained that Dr. Dearborn was on his way down to the emergency room. He had already heard that there was a baby coming in.
Once Brian was stabilized, Dr. Dearborn performed a bronchoscopy. The procedure confirmed Brian's lungs were full of blood. Dearborn believed he could be dealing with another case of Stachybotrys exposure.
Dr. Dearborn came in and met with my husband and I and discussed the different things that were going on with Brian's immune system, with what could be in our home.
Health inspectors were dispatched to the McGuire's home. If confirmed, this would be one of the few cases outside of inner-city Cleveland, a sign that the toxic mold was more widespread than investigators had thought. Health officials began their search in the basement. They found traces of mold, but they weren't sure it was the kind they were looking for. They gathered samples to find out. The results were surprising.
The original health inspection at our home came back negative surface samples, negative air samples.
Dr. Dearborn wondered if the infant had been exposed somewhere else.
My husband was bound and determined that there had to be a problem in the house. That was the only place that my son had really been, besides my parents' house.
David McGuire refused to give up. His instincts told him to conduct his own inspection, scouring every inch of the house.
So my husband was more persistent and ended up going into a crawl space in our basement where I had some things in storage. Started going through books and boxes and finding this mold.
The McGuire's were right. The family had the mold removed, and after nearly a week in the hospital, Brian's condition improved. The family was ready to return home, but they would have to wait.
After we were released from the hospital, my children and I had to go and stay with my in-laws for, I would say, somewhere around a month while my husband worked on our house, our basement, and our heating system and our cold air returns.
In the months that followed, public health officials gradually brought the epidemic under control in Cleveland.
We started a prevention program where we would follow up the newborns going home to the geographic cluster area, and the city housing and county housing and health departments would provide an inspection of the homes to see whether there was water damage, whether there was mold. And where we found significant water damage and mold, we did what we could to remove the infants from that environment until it was taken care of.
Investigators published the results of their study in hopes of alerting other health officials to their findings.
We wanted to find out whether this was unique to Cleveland or whether or not it was occurring elsewhere.
The answer that came back was alarming. Their cases were indeed just the tip of the iceberg. As 1998 was dawning, more cases of pulmonary hemorrhaging in infants were turning up all over the country. Doctors wondered if Stachybotrys could be affecting older children. They soon found out. Over 800 miles away from Cleveland, Dr. Jay Portnoy, an allergist at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri, was treating toddler Brian Chubb for a severe asthma problem. Despite medication, Brian's asthma persisted. The doctor tested Brian, but he showed no reaction to molds, dust, or any other allergens. A full physical exam revealed that Brian was an otherwise healthy toddler.
When I first saw Brian, he had a history of asthma. He had a lot of respiratory problems, a lot of wheezing and coughing and difficulty breathing, and he was needing to be on a lot of medication in order to control those symptoms.
Brian's mother and father, Lori and Stephen Chubb, heard about children having respiratory problems because of Stachybotrys mold. But Brian was older than the cases reported in Cleveland. Still, Brian's parents wondered if there might be a connection between mold and their child's asthma. They were concerned, and Brian was suffering.
You hear the wheezing clear down into his lungs, and getting up in the morning and eating breakfast, he would have I almost called it a smoker's cough, a very dry, hacking cough in the morning at the breakfast table almost every morning. And it's just sad to listen to a very tiny child that is almost having trouble, struggling to just take a breath.
Dr. Portnoy requested Brian's family have an environmental assessment done of their home. Industrial hygienist Susan Flappin was brought in to inspect the boy's home. First, she tested the air in the basement. And right away, the findings were clear.
And we found that there was Stachybotrys in the air in the basement, and that the mold counts were high in the basement.
Brian's father, Stephen Chubb, was amazed at the quantity of the mold spores.
When they started telling us that normal household has 3,000 to 4,000 particles of mold, and we were testing in our basement at 12,000 particles, it definitely drew our attention.
The mold was growing out of control. But for Susan Flappin and health officials nationwide, the most alarming thing was that it was beginning to happen all across the country. An outbreak of bleeding lungs threatened the lives of infants in Cleveland. Now, a Kansas City doctor suspected Stachybotrys mold was affecting the health of children there as well. When industrial hygienist Susan Flappin was called into one sick boy's home, she got high readings for airborne mold, but she couldn't locate the source.
A lot of times there is hidden mold, and so it can be, you may see just a small patch of mold on the outside of the wall, but when you get into it, it could be a very large patch, or it could be hidden underneath the carpet or in the ventilation system or any number of places. So this was something that we needed to investigate further.
An examiner took apart the wall where Susan believed the mold might be hiding.
The mold and the water was behind the wall of a finished part of the basement that you could not see.
Lurking behind the finished walls of the Chubbs' basement was the toxic mold Stachybotrys.
What you really need to do in those circumstances is try to physically remove the mold by cutting out the sheetrock, or if you can remove the wood, you need to remove it and replace it. That's really the only solution. If you can't physically remove it, the best you can do is just to scrub it off as best as you can and seal it up.
An environmental technician went to work removing it from the walls with a non-toxic cleaning agent and disinfecting the entire area. Once the cleanup was complete, Susan returned to test the air in the house for Stachybotrys mold particles.
The counts actually had gone from the 12,000 level to about 100, and so it had dramatically dropped.
6 months after the house was cleared of mold, the child's asthma symptoms also disappeared.
And it convinced me that there probably was an association between the exposure that he had in his home to the mold and the symptoms he was experiencing.
On the other side of town, the mold was hitting even harder. For the first time, an entire family was experiencing chronic health problems. 12-year-old Amy McGuire struggled with recurring stomach pain and high fevers. Doctors could not find the cause of her illness. For months, her mother Julie was alarmed.
When everybody was so sick, especially Amy, I was very concerned, and I was extremely frustrated because all I would hear from the doctors is, well, it's some kind of virus. It's some kind of virus. We don't know what it is.
For the McGuire family, a television news segment on Stachybotrys mold offered a possible clue to their chronic illness.
The light bulb went on in my head, and I really had a gut feeling that we were now dealing with mold, definitely.
While watching the program, they were called that a handyman remodeling the family's basement had removed an old shower and exposed a large section of wall covered with a slimy black mold. The handyman had developed respiratory problems almost immediately, and soon after, the family did too. Julie contacted the allergist interviewed in the news clip and set up an appointment.
I told her the story about our shower being remodeled, that there had been mold behind it, that 2 members of the family at least had been sick numerous times over just the past few months, and she became very, very interested in our story.
Because of her experience, Susan Flappin was called in to inspect the McGuire's basement. Although the family had cleaned the mold exposed by the shower, Sue suspected that there were traces left. She took samples for testing.
We discovered that they also had some mold, and because it was so close to the furnace, that mold could be distributed to other parts of the house.
Susan also brought a nurse to take blood samples from the entire family. She wanted to see if their blood contained traces of the Stachybotrys toxins. Lab analysis of the basement samples showed that Stachybotrys was in the McGuire's house. To avoid further exposure, the McGuires had their home professionally cleaned with bleach and special filters to clean the air. Within weeks, they began to recover. Analyzing the McGuire's blood samples, Susan also found an interesting result.
She told us that every one of us had the antibodies in our blood. Our daughter Amy had the highest reading, and then Steve had the second highest, and then me, and then our son Sean. And it really made a lot of sense because Amy was the sickest.
While toxic mold has always been around, it is only recently that the full effects of mold are beginning to be understood. From Texas to California to Florida, there have been thousands of reported cases. Some reports say that up to 30% of U.S. homes have a mold problem, affecting as many as 26 million Americans. And yet, because the science of this mold is just in its infancy, no one knows for sure exactly how many respiratory diseases can be directly linked to Stachybotrys.
While our focus in Cleveland has predominantly been on the connection with young infants and their apparent vulnerability, there has been a beginning recognition that mold, particularly toxic molds, can be of health problems to older children and adults. And here there's a fair amount of controversy because we really don't know exactly what the health effects are.
In light of growing concern over mold, the CDC is currently working on a more complete study to further explore the connection between Stachybotrys and a wide range of respiratory illnesses, including asthma, allergies, and lung infections. Other research is underway to determine what levels of exposure to mold can be harmful. Dr. Dor Dearborn believes that for now, the best cure against any potentially toxic mold exposure is prevention.
It only makes sense that we take a prudent approach and don't live in moldy environments. And the way we do that is when we have a water problem, a plumbing leak, a roof leak, we clean it up within a day or two so that we don't get mold growth.
Infants in Cleveland who recovered from the possible effects of toxic mold have grown up and are now breathing easier.
This entire experience changed everything on how I look at life. And now I try and take the time to sit back and enjoy life and not always be in a hurry and not always take everything for granted. Quickly, things that are very, very important to you can be taken away from you, in particular, people that you love.
Natasha Carter is thankful for Dr. Dearborn's help and her son Robert's recovery.
Every time I move now, I have to get my house checked to make sure that it's safe for my son.
For those public health officials who continue to study mold, identifying Stachybotrys as a possible threat is only the beginning.
The success of any individual scientific discovery is whether or not we've learned something about health that is going to benefit the people. And in fact, here, I believe we've learned something that's benefited hundreds of young infants throughout the country.
Today, across America, doctors and patients alike are now alerted to the potentially deadly symptoms of Stachybotrys mold. While mold has always been in people's homes, even the Stachybotrys mold, no one can say how widespread this problem could be. And until scientists know more, the battle against toxic mold will continue, one home at a time.